In this lesson, we'll talk a little bit more about the kinds of files that we can save in Maya. So going to File and going to Save or Save As will allow you to go in and save your file in different formats. If we go into Save As and go into the options, which is that little box over here on the right on any of these tools, we can get our Save Scene As options. So we can choose the default file type that we want to save as. So we've got two different choices here, Maya ASCII or Maya Binary. Now in the past, a lot of people would save in Maya ASCII because if there was a problem between versions, it was sometimes a little bit easier to fix those problems because you could go in and change some of the code inside of the files. So it's up to you whether you want to use ASCII or binary files. Then you also have some options for your caching and things like that if you want to change those. And then you can go in and save scene as or save and close. If you just go in and go to Save Scene As, that'll bring up our file dialog here, which we looked at in the last lesson. This will let us go in and save this. So let's say that we want to call this something like cube02. And one of the things that a lot of people will do is increment their files. So as you're working, you want to go ahead and every so often you want to save an increment. So cube02, cube03, cube04. So just so you're not saving into one big scene file, because think about it, if you work all day and you keep saving into the same file, then if that file gets corrupted or something happens to it, you've lost a whole day. Versus if you increment, then you can always go back to the last time you saved. So in this case, we've just added an O2 to the end of it, and we can just save as. You can the name, you can't see it, it's above the screen up here, but it'll show you the name of the file. So it's cube02 right now. If we go in and do increment and save, and there's hotkey combinations here that you can see next to that. We go in, it's going to tell you there's no changes to save. Let me rotate this around a little bit. So let me increment and save. So it's going to add another value onto the end. So if you just had cube, it'll increment that and add that padding onto the end of it. You can also manually increment, which is what I normally do. And so for that, you would just go in and go save as whenever you're ready to save it out. And then I would just go in here and increment it myself, make that cube 3, and save that. Now, you can also kind of set this up to happen automatically so that if you forget for whatever reason to save, then you'll still have a backup plan. So to take a look at that, let's go into Windows, Settings, Preferences, and let's go into Preferences. So this will bring up a lot of different preferences that we can set for our Maya experience, and we'll go into some of these a little bit later. But what we want to do is change, turn on autosave. Okay, so we want to go to under Settings, Files, and Projects. So let's click on that. So here we can define where our default project is, or where we want to always start when we start up Maya. We can choose our history. So we could go in, there's a recent files over here. We can choose how many of those files to keep. And then we can also turn on autosave. So if we enable this, we can choose whether we want Maya to prompt us before it saves. And then we can also choose whether to limit the number of saves. So if we limit it, then it'll only keep the last 10 autosaves that we've done. We can also set the interval. So if you set it to 10 minutes, what that means is if something happens, which is what all this is for, if something happens, you'll only lose the last 10 minutes of work at most. So if that's a little bit too frequent, because sometimes while you're working, it can kind of interrupt things a little bit if it's going a little bit too often, you can always change this interval to be, 30 minutes or whatever it is that you want. And then you can set it a special autosave destination, or it'll just save it into your project in a special folder that we set up originally. So you can go ahead and set that setting. It just kind of gives you a little bit of a peace of mind as far as being able to know that if something happens, you can always go back. So you never want to have that experience where you've done all this work and solved all these problems and only to realize that something's happened to the file and it's corrupted or for whatever reason, and you can't go back. You have to go back a whole day or 2 days even. So autosave can help you. You can just take a look at the interval. If it's a little bit too short, keeps interrupting you, you can go in and increase that value a little bit as far as the number of minutes that is going between saves. Okay, so a a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about. Now, we talked about saving as a Maya ASCII or Maya binary file, but we can also save in formats that are able to be read by other applications. And so we can export as an OBJ or export as a FBX, are two of the most popular. So if we select that and we go to export under import export, go into the options, you can see I can export this out, this object out, or whatever I have selected. I can export it as a Maya file, or I can come down and I can export it as an OBJ, and that kind of file will hold mainly our geometry and our UV information. And then if you want to have a little bit more like animation, things like that, you can export as an FBX. And both of these file types can be read by other applications. So if you're taking your geometry into something like ZBrush, you can definitely use OBJ, although there is, with GoZ, the ability to go back and forth more easily. But really, OBJ is a pretty universal file format that can be read in just about anything. And then FBX is a little bit more full-featured format. Okay, so you've got the Maya files, and then you've got FBX and OBJ, and there's some other options for you depending on what you need to do. If it's some kind of a specialty application, it may have its own file format. Okay, and that's all going to be found under File and under the Save portion, and then also under Import and Export. And then remember those preferences, we can go to Window, Settings, Preferences, and the Autosave is going to be under Settings, Files and Projects. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about saving, let's go in and look at how we can change how our viewport looks and how the geometry within that viewport looks. So let's do that next.